Welcome everybody to this year's LESZEK KOŁAKOWSKI lecture, which commemorates Oxford's most celebrated Polish scholar, the philosopher LESZEK KOŁAKOWSKI. Welcome also to the very numerous audience online who would be welcome to put questions into the Q&A thread on the Zoom. Our lecturer this year is Professor Michał Bilewicz. He is Professor of Psychology at the University of Warsaw, specializes in social and political psychology, and directs a center for research on prejudices, a rich subject in any society, and has become well known in Poland's public debate for his contributions on prejudices in Poland in comparative perspective. 2 months ago, we had Jarosław Kuisz speaking about post-traumatic sovereignty in Poland. Today, Professor Bilewicz is going to talk on the basis of his new book, Traumaland, about how Poland's Second World War past shapes its collective mentality and politics today. So we're big on Polish trauma this academic year, and we look forward very much to your lecture. So yes, can we make it full screen?
So thank you very much for the invitation, and very big privilege for me to speak, and particularly it's a deeply personal moment to me to speak at the lecture in honor of LESZEK KOŁAKOWSKI. Exactly 23 years ago, as a student, I sat in the basement of Warsaw College in seminar room number 3, attending his seminars. Seminars of LESZEK KOŁAKOWSKI was a great and very inspiring intellectual journey for many of us. These were attended mostly by Polish students and Polish doctoral candidates in Oxford. Each session began from approximately 1 hour presentation by a speaker, and then there was a co-presentation by Professor KOłakowski, who would give additional 1 hour talk on the same theme, regardless of the topic. So some of them concerned the Byzantine art, social capital, Polish education system, or, as in my case, lay explanations in social psychology. In all those cases, Kołakowski's responses were very insightful, and he were really guiding us to new avenues of inquiry. So I really feel this was a very life-changing experience those more than 20 years ago. Now, today, exactly similarly to Jarosław Kuisz, I would like to focus on the role of trauma in Polish politics, although the trauma I will discuss today is more related to the war experience rather than statelessness. And I would like to start from the picture that kind of guided much of my own research, or symbolizes maybe a good metaphor of the research I've been doing in that field. And the photo is important for me also because it has been taken on the roof of the building of the Department of Psychology, the University of Warsaw. My room and my lab is located exactly in this same building, and this is the only building that survived, one of the 2 buildings that survived in that part of the Warsaw ghetto. The building was used by SS troopers as the headquarters of SS during the existence of the Warsaw ghetto. This is just in front of the building. There's an Umschlagplatz from which the Jewish members of the Jewish Committee of Warsaw were deported to Treblinka. And right after the war, the building was populated by few families that just had their apartments in the building. And you can see we actually didn't, still until today, we didn't recognize who that person exactly is. But there was a girl, young girl, living in this building and living basically on the sea of ruins, right? So the question which guided my research in that area also is related to that. So what were the emotions, feelings, what was the mentality of those people who lived on this sea of ruins, how war has impacted them, and how these impacts might translate into what Poland is today, and what problems do we have to face in Polish mentality and Polish politics today. This theme has been studied right after the war in Poland by a number of Polish psychologists who came back after the war and took their positions, took their chairs at Polish universities that were rebuilt after the war. For example, Stefan Balej, a prominent pre-war Polish psychologist of Ukrainian origin, who was professor at University in Lviv, and then he moved to Warsaw. First Polish social psychologist, but also developmental psychologist and educational psychologist. So he did a lot of research among adolescents about values of young people, and he studied extensively psychological problems of young people in Poland right after the war. His summary of this research allowed him to coin this term war complex. At that time, there was no research on PTSD. The term PTSD has been invented by another Polish psychologist, I mean, maybe not Polish, but psychologist born in Włocławek, Professor Shatton, who actually created the term PTSD in 1970s. At that time, they were describing the war complex, and Balej was really surprised by the enormous change in the mentality of the young generation of Poles after the war. So what he found, after making numerous questionnaire studies, interview studies, even experimental studies, was that he found very high levels of mistrust. He found that young people are suspicious, irritable, unable to feel joy, and constantly feeling sense of injustice, that they are badly treated, that they are not properly treated, and completely not trusting authorities, institutions, breaking the rules. And this has been found not only in his studies, but also by other researchers of that generation. For example, Zygmunt Putkiewicz, who conducted interviews with adolescents who survived the war in such districts as Wola and Ochota in Warsaw, which were the most affected during the Warsaw Uprising. So there were massacres, enormous massacres of civilian populations. For example, in one day, August the 5th, in Wola, more than 40,000 of civilians were killed during one day by the Nazi Germans and collaborators from Rona and from the troops that collaborated with them. But generally, those young people, what Putkiewicz finds, had this war complex to the largest extent. So what he found was that in these interviews, people were telling him that they always feel injustice. Everywhere they go, they see injustice. They see plots against them. They try to break all norms and rules in their everyday life. They try to lie. So, like this example from the young woman aged 17 who says that you have to lie everywhere you go. Have to lie. You need to lie. If you don't lie in your life, others will basically eat you, and that's it, right? So this was the mentality of that generation. As I said, at that time, the term PTSD has not been invented yet, but now we know actually what these people have suffered, right? So PTSD is something that's very well post-traumatic stress disorder, and a disorder that has been very well studied by psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. So people who have experienced mass trauma, they suffer from anxiety, flashbacks, hypervigilance. So these intrusive thoughts from the time of trauma, they endanger their abilities of living a normal life. So basically, they cannot normally function in work settings, but also in their family life. But at the same time, when we think about this war complex, the war complex, it also operates at the level which I would call a social level. So such phenomena as mistrust, aggression, sense of injustice, these phenomena that might have been adaptive in the situation of war become maladaptive after the war is over. Right? So they remain with those people. And now what we know from more recent research is that these effects last. So this is what happens in the generation of people who were survivors. So what happens in the subsequent generation? Again, from psychiatric and psychological research, we know that people who have experienced, who have PTSD, it affects also their children and even grandchildren. So there's a lot of research talking about a transgenerational transmission of trauma symptoms. But it's usually not about particular symptoms, but it's basically about stronger reaction to traumatic stressors in the subsequent generation. So basically, if you're a child or a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor in Israel, you react more strongly to such events as, for example, October the 7th or the war in Lebanon than people who are Israelis who did not have as their ancestors Holocaust survivors, whose ancestors were from the Middle East or who. So this is something we know from empirical research on the topic. But also, it's quite plausible that a generation that has suffered war and that has developed certain mentality that was adaptive in the times of war and became maladaptive, so this mistrust, anxiety in their everyday functioning, feeling that institutions are against us, seeing plots and conspiracies everywhere, they would pass this knowledge to the subsequent generations. Basically, in the process of development of the subsequent generations, these are the narratives which will be passed in the families. And this produces what we call in psychology conspiracy mentality, so a tendency to interpret social and political life through the perspective of conspiracy. So seeing conspiracies even where they do not exist, right? So some conspiracies obviously are present in the world, but the tendency to interpret whole political life in terms of conspiracy theories, this is what we call in psychology conspiracy mentality. But also historical narcissism, so the perception that our history has not been acknowledged properly. So this kind of very high sensitivity to all situations in which others might not acknowledge our past and our suffering properly. And those effects, we see them particularly strong in times of crisis. And today I would like to focus on 4 of such crises, and I describe more of these consequences in my book, but I thought that these 4 crises are quite important to understand because they allow us to get some insight about the political nature of Poland and the kind of social psychology of Poles today. So first of those crises would be the crisis of 2010, the one related to the Smolensk air catastrophe. And this was a crisis which endangered social cohesion in Poland and devastated political life for many years. The next crisis that I wanted to discuss was the crisis of 2015, and the crisis related to the migration discourses that affected very much Polish openness to diversity and migration, and also to some extent constrained Polish development, also because of the anti-immigrant stance and anti-immigrant attitude of Poles that emerged after that crisis. Then crisis of 2018. So I will talk a little bit about the so-called Holocaust law in Poland, so the amendment of the law on Institute of National Remembrance. It led to a very defensive reaction of Polish government and the Polish right-wing scene that ultimately in fact, endangered Polish ability to confront our own past, our own history. And the crisis of 2019 that, or 2020 in Poland, the crisis of COVID that affected the public health in Poland very much, and I will talk about it in a minute. First, I want to start from the crisis of 2010. And it all starts from the aviational catastrophe. So something which we know from also other countries, if you probably remember 2014, Boeing flying from Schiphol Airport to in Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur has been shot by a Russian missile in the Donbas area. Nobody survived the air crash. And you could see that the country grieved, but did not remain in mourning for a long time. So there was the Dutch calmly awaited the results of the investigation. That took many, many years, but there was no really big reaction to this dramatic air catastrophe, which was obviously caused by the Donbas separatists who were aligned with Russia. Another catastrophe like that, 1994, Falcon 50 aircraft flying from Tanzania to Burundi with the president of Rwanda, President Habyarimana, on board, and the chief of the staff of the Rwandan army. Again, hit by the missile, everybody died in the accident. The reaction was completely different. So in Rwanda, governmental radio immediately blamed the Tutsi population for the tragedy. This triggered the genocide, mass killing that lasted for 100 days, and almost a million people were killed. So, this huge reaction of the population that led immediately to genocide. Now, how can we understand that these two nations reacted so differently to a very similar situation? And I would like to propose that the reaction might be a consequence of the history of these societies. So if you think about Rwanda, this is a society which has been colonized and that the colonial powers of Germany and Belgium not only created the divides between different ethnicities, but also they created specific mentality, which led to this, to a certain extent, to such overreaction to air crash. This brings us to Poland, or actually to Russia. In Smolensk, the presidential aircraft Tu-154 plane crashed near Smolensk. And what has happened? So immediately after, we could see this atmosphere of mourning, and people were gathering and collectively, the transport of the bodies has been organized, and you could see masses of inhabitants of Warsaw walking from place to place, all places related to those people who were killed in the catastrophe, because the president Lech Kaczyński, together with his wife, had died in the catastrophe. But not only them, there were representatives of the Liberal Party, the representatives of the left wing, some of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, priests, and other people. So everybody knew someone who has died there, and this happened for certain days. Actually, what was something very surprising is that even in television, in public media, in generally newspapers, the atmosphere really calmed down. So there was completely no political discussion or political debate about that. So there was this atmosphere of mourning that lasted for many, many years. And then there was everything started in the moment of the burial when the decision was discussed about the burial of the president of Poland at Baden-Castle. And this was the moment when the conspiracy theories started to emerge. Conspiracy theories that tried to blame Polish government, acting in collaboration with Vladimir Putin and with the Russian authorities. So basically suggesting that this has not been an incident, an aircraft crash, but a planned assassination of Polish president. So there are multiple conspiracy theories around that. Some of them suggesting that there was a thermobaric bomb, nitroglycerin has been used artificial fog, electromagnetic interference, many theories suggesting different causes of the air crash. This created a huge division in the society. Approximately 30% of the society believed in those conspiracy theories. And at that time, we studied actually people who were those people who believed in those conspiracy theories. Obviously, some of them, it's obvious that the very important factor was political partisanship. So basically, people who were associated with the Law and Justice Party, the party from the president was actually a leader before of that party, but not only. What we found in the studies that we're doing at the time was that this division between the support conspiracy believers and conspiracy non-believers, so the tendency to believe in those conspiratorial theories was to a large extent shaped by what we call collective victim, sense of collective victim. So basically people who are more interested in history, who read more about Polish history, particularly about the history of Polish victimhood, so who think more constantly think about this Polish martyrological victimhood history, those people would, when they have learned about what has happened in Smolensk, they would automatically interpret it through the lens of this narrative. So they would consider this to be another instance of the suffering of Poles caused by others and the conspiracy against Poland. And we've seen that actually this led to this what we call traumatic rift. So basically the split of the society. So we found in that study that much of those people who believed in conspiracy, they didn't want to accept conspiracy non-believers as their neighbors, co-workers. They would not like to have them in their family. And the same on the other side, even to a greater extent, those people who didn't believe in this conspiracy account of Smolensk catastrophe, they would not accept conspiracy believers in their close environment. Which we're quite surprised to see. It led to this level of political divide in the society that it even affected people's everyday life. And then I want to bring it to a completely different context, so the context of Greece. And in Greece, together with Tafilos Kinopoulos and Michał Pantazi, who was actually at that time at the Oxford Internet Institute here, we were doing some studies about this tendency to believe in conspiracy and how it is affected by victimhood, by the sense of victimhood in Greece. Why in Greece? Because, first of all, Greece is quite symmetrical to Poland in terms of, first of all, Greece had this traumatic war experiences during the Second World War. And then what is similar, and maybe I would bring it close to Jarosław Kulisz, actually, because right after the war, they had a very symmetrical situation to Poland, because Greeks really wanted to have left-wing, be it communist or socialist government. So there was a huge, massive support, because the left-wing was actually played key role in the underground in Greece. In Poland, it was just the opposite, right? But the post-war Yalta order put Greece on the other side. So we know the story quite well in Poland, because we had many Greek refugees. So Greek communists fled to Poland, and there were even big Greek settlements in Silesia. In a similar way, like Poles fled to Britain, right? So those Poles who didn't agree with the communist politics. So this was the situation in Greece was very much, there is this trauma of and also a sense of powerlessness, that even after this war we couldn't build our state on our own rights. And now in Greece, you might remember that in 2009 and during the economic crisis, there were many conspiracy theories about that particularly. So financial conspiracies, the plots of the bankers and international institutions, particularly Germany being the agent that actually intentionally wanted to destroy Greek economy. And in that study, we found that among those Greeks who strongly identify with their nation, we found that exactly among them, the ones who think more about this martyrdom, about this victimhood, about this historical victimization, they would also more often believe in conspiracy theories. So we found this effect both in conspiracy mentality, when also looking at the beliefs in financial conspiracy, but also the general legitimacy of conspiracy theories that we presented to them. They said to those who would be more focused on this traumatic history, they would also be more willing to interpret contemporary politics in terms of conspiracy beliefs. And after that, we thought that maybe in Poland, actually, we want to check something more. So we found the same pattern in Poland, but we wanted to see whether this victimhood is something that can be primed, so something that can be primed by different situations. And we used a very simple priming procedure in which we invited participants to a very small laboratory experimental study in one condition. Participants, the task was very simple. They were just scrambled letters in a word, and in this scrambled letters word, participants were asked to form a meaningful words from a scrambled letter. So we told them there are two studies. So first study is about your cognitive basically capacities, and the second study will be about your political views. But in this first study, or first phase of the study, there were two conditions. In the first condition, these words looked like that. Actually, from this word, everybody in the room who speaks Polish probably knows what kind of words you can build from that. So one was Katyń, another was war, another one was Oświęcim, the Auschwitz camp, etc. And in the second condition, participants would receive similar words, but also related to history, but not to the traumatic history. So this would be Jagiełło, the Polish king, or Wawel, Polish royal castle in Kraków, Sobieski. So they would be also related to the history, but not to the traumatic history. And after that, we would ask participants about their attitudes, political views, etc. And again, we found something similar that we found in Greece, that for those participants, those Polish people who would be strongly identified with their nation, for whom Polish national identity would be particularly important, among them, this simple priming would produce higher levels of conspiracy mentality, but also a tendency, it was quite a small tendency, to also interpret Smolensk catastrophe in a more conspiratorial way. And this was years after the Smolensk catastrophe has happened, right? So you can see actually that by stressing this history, by priming this traumatic history, you can actually elevate conspiratorial thinking about politics in such society. You know, I want to move to the second crisis, which I wanted to discuss with you. So the so-called migration crisis. Okay, why so-called? Because in Poland, there was no migration crisis. In Poland was one of these few countries in Europe in 2015 that has not received almost any immigrants from this big migration through Mediterranean. And we know in Poland that there is a tendency in Poland to the tendency of moral panics around, particularly around children and safety, security and safety of those most vulnerable, children, women. And Łukasz Krzyżanowski and Marcin Zaręba, historians who have studied that extensively, they found that in all those big events in Poland, for example, in 1976 protests in Radom, in 1956 protests in Poznań, you always had this element. So people would be completely panicking around the safety of children. So there would be gossips about missing children, and they would lead to riots and to big unrest. We all know, of course, how it ended in 1940s as a wave of pogroms, right? What Jan Tomasz Gross is describing it here. Pogrom in Kielce, in Kraków, in Rzeszów, they all started from a gossip that a child is missing. And after those gossip, as for example in Kielce, you could see not only a pogrom committed by extreme right-wingers, nationalists, anti-Semites, but you would see also their political opponents. You would see policemen from KBW, from police, workers from the factory, all of them actually gathering together in this riot and committing pogrom of the Jewish last surviving Jews in Kielce, just because they thought that a Jewish child has been captured, has been enslaved by them, and there is another child which is still enslaved. So this was coming from this gossip was coming from one child actually who just suggested them that Jews are kidnapping children. Now, how this small gossip can lead to a pogrom, Zaremba and Krzyżanowski suggest that this is a consequence of the war experiences. So for the generation that has lost so many children, they were afraid that after the war, this might repeat, that this is something that might happen again. So this kind of allows us to understand different panics, including the panic in 2015. So in 2015, at the height of the crisis, the height of this refugee, this big migration of refugees, if you look, for example, on Sweden, during last week of October 2015, within 1 week, Sweden has accepted 10,000 refugees. And to Poland, only 3 people came in that. Right? So you can see that this was basically something that didn't affect Poland at all. Now, although it did not affect Poland, if you look on the reaction of Polish media, suggesting that there are mortal diseases that might affect Europe because of the refugees, you could see massive protests and rallies, anti-immigrant rallies in Warsaw of the scale that I have never seen in my life. Such big right-wing rallies, Islamophobic rallies, but also the mass media, the way they covered that, they would always talk about those invading hordes. 90,000 Arabs will flood Poland, warned Super Express, which is not particularly right-wing outlet. Invaders, these are invaders, not refugees, as you can see here on the screen. All those metaphors, but also metaphors of rape. So on the cover of one of these journals, I put it here because it was too explicit to show, they would write Islamic rape of Europe and presenting a blonde woman draped in the EU flag, surrounded by dark-skinned men. This moral panic is something which severely, you can see how it affected attitudes of Polish people. So these are representative sample studies in which we asked whether people would accept a Muslim person as their co-worker or as a neighbor. So, we don't see the dates here on the screen, but I think the first study was 2013. So in 2013, you had 20% of people who said, I would not accept a person as my co-worker if I learned that the person is Muslim. But then 2014 and 2017 are the two measurements. So in 2015, it would be 33%. So every third Polish person would say, I would not accept such a person. And then 45% Poles, after this moral panic of 2015, would not accept a Muslim co-worker. As neighbors, more than half of the Polish people would not accept a Muslim, and 20%, just within 2 years. It's very, very rare in social studies that we see such fast change of attitudes in any field. This was very, at the time we also were doing studies on hate speech, and together with the Stefan Batory Foundation, these were representative nationwide surveys on adults and also representative surveys of adolescents, so of high school students. And there we found something very similar, that we asked people how often do they see hate speech on internet. So we didn't ask about hate speech, we presented examples of hate speech, Islamophobic hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech, and we asked them, how often do you see that on TV, on internet? So the increases are also so fast. From 2014, only 1 in 5 people would say that they have seen Islamophobic contents on TV, but then in 2016, every second Polish person declares that he or she has seen such contents. On the internet, even more. So you can see that among young people, particularly among adolescents, in 2016, 80%. So exactly every Polish, almost every Polish youngster has seen Islamophobic contents on the internet. So you can see how widespread was that moral panic. But also it affected attitudes. So we asked them, we presented them with some examples of these hate speech from internet. And we asked them whether do they consider this offensive or not. So this statement you see on the top, in 2014, 2/3 of adult Polish people and 2/3 of young Polish people would say this is definitely an offensive statement. Then 2 years later, it's already less than half of adults and only 30% of young Polish people who consider it offensive. So it shows you this desensitization to hate speech, right? It's gained basically a norm, and said this is basically the language we use when talking about that. And just a week before the election, so 2015, during which this moral panic has been very extensively used, we did a study of young voters. Why I think it's important? Because young voters were the ones who, for the first time in the Polish history after 1989, massively voted for the right wing. Young voters were usually voting for the liberals and for the social democrats. In 2015, 60% of them voted for one of the three right-wing parties and anti-immigrant parties. So this was this big shift, and we tried to understand what's really happening with those young voters in a survey before the election. So we found that this typical antecedents of voting for right-wing, like authoritarianism, relative deprivation, as always, would differentiate those voters of those right-wing parties from voters of other parties. But additionally to that, fear of Muslims. Young people who have, most of them never encountered any Muslim person, would vote for right-wing parties because they were panicking, because they were afraid of the Muslim migration. So this shows you how you can use this as a means to mobilize electorate, particularly the young electorate. The next crisis is the crisis around the Holocaust law in Poland, and this crisis started from the amendment of the Institute of National Remembrance law that basically attempted to ban blaming Polish people for complicity in the Holocaust, or it actually made this crime of stating publicly that the Polish nation was responsible or co-responsible for any war crimes or genocide, be punished for up to 3 years of prison. So there was really a draconic law. It was really a very harsh law, and obviously there was a very big international outcry and very strong reaction from Israel, United States, but also Holocaust historians in Poland and elsewhere. Basically, people who are afraid that even if you bring a Holocaust survivor to Poland to tell his story in Auschwitz, the person might be basically arrested and sentenced for 3 years of imprisonment. Right? So this law has been amended then in June 2018, so the criminal penalties have been removed. But what happened after this law has been, the first version of this amendment was voted in the Polish parliament? You would have rallies in front of presidential palace of people telling the Polish president, take off your yarmulke and sign the law, right? Sign this new. So there was a pressure from the society on the president to sign this bit of law. You could see anti-Semitic caricatures in the Polish media. So this is the case of Mr. Cezary Krzysztofa, who published this caricature in one of widely read weeklies, suggesting that Polish Holocaust, is actually the Holocaust of Polish people. And you can see here that this Soviet killer, it was of course alleged reference to Katyn. He has a Magenta, he has a Star of David, the star does not look like the Bolshevik star. Attack on Poland, and again in the media you could see all those elements of now the paradox of this whole reaction, this another panic, is that we've seen that when we analyze, for example, the searches in Google, how often people search for the term Polish Holocaust. So something that they attempted to change, right? They attempted to fight with the term Polish Holocaust or Polish genocide or Polish death camps. So we were trying to see how often the term Polish death camps has been used internationally. And we've seen that actually there's a spike. During the debate around it, this led to the spike of interest in the term. Before this legislation has been passed, most users of internet all around the world would use rather the term German death camps, and only in Poland you would see some people searching for Polish death camps. Now, a few months later, when the law has been passed, you can see that almost America, Canada, Australia, they start searching for Polish death camps suddenly, right? This term became popularized by this same legislation that has been. Now, what is it based on? Why people reacted so furiously to that? Why why it mobilized such a panic? Now, I wanted to stress some research that we've been doing on perceptions. We started doing this exactly during this debate on the law around the Institute of National Remembrance. And we asked people in Poland, using representative large samples, how do they perceive behavior of Poles during the Holocaust, behavior of Poles toward Jews? So the average Polish person would say that 58% of Poles were feeling compassion toward Jews, that 46% of Poles were actively rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. And then the numbers of people who say that Poles were indifferent are approximately 43%. 41%, they would say, the average Polish person would say that 41% of Poles refused to help. These numbers do not add to each other, of course, right? But they and Poles who would be collaborating with the Nazis in killing Jews, the average person would say that 26% were actively collaborating. These numbers are quite surprising. We've discussed them with Holocaust historians, and we've repeated this study many times since then. And we found that, first of all, what you see here is this absolute illusion about the righteousness of Polish nation. So it's not that politicians have invented this Holocaust law, but they responded to the shared perception of the behavior of Poles during the Holocaust, the perception that Poles were just angels. But not only angels, because these numbers are also quite surprising. Polish people today think that 1 in 4 people in Poland were actively collaborating with the Nazis. Which is also, when you think about the underground state and the repressions, that it was also a dangerous thing to do. So what we as psychologists are usually, what we know from any studies of human behavior is that people are generally not helping, not risking their life, and they try to be basically passive bystanders as long as they can, right? But this is not the lay perception in Poland. And we recently tried to analyze that and finding that this is very much impacted by anti-Semitism. So we did some longitudinal modeling to see what's the cause here. And it seems that basically these distortions of the Holocaust history, so people who think about Polish nation being completely righteous and being only rescuers of Jews, it's very much driven by anti-Semitism. But I don't want to stop here, because where this anti-Semitism comes from. And here are the studies that we've been doing, trying to explain anti-Semitism in Poland, different forms of anti-Semitism, traditional, secondary anti-Semitism, believing Jewish conspiracy. All of them are significantly correlated with the sense of victimhood. So people who feel we were more victimized than any other nations, we suffered more than others, they would today be much more anti-Semitic. So there is a sense of victimhood competition, basically. And not only in Poland, exactly, like Antony and Kosmidis, once in Oxford, I think now in European University Institute, they found something similar in Greece, that people who think in Greece that Greeks have suffered more than Jews have, they would more often believe in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But the most interesting studies in that area come from a researcher from Brussels, Laura de Guismet, who found the same effect among Congolese immigrants in Belgium. And now she found, first of all, she was very surprised to see high levels of anti-Semitism among Congolese immigrants in Belgium who have never met any Jewish person in Congo, right? So how can you be anti-Semitic? I mean, in Britain, of course, you can see anti-Semitic elements in Merchant of Venice, right? After several centuries of the people living without any Jewish presence in the country. But okay, it was quite surprising. Why in Congolese people, particularly? And she started exploring that. And what she found was that it's actually driven by the sense of collective victim. Because Congolese immigrants are great-grandchildren of people who have suffered genocide under the King Leopold II, when Congo was not even a colony, a personal ownership, right, of the Belgian king. And she found that the more people know about that, the more they realize lack of recognition of their suffering in Belgium, the lack of recognition of those crimes in Belgium. And the more they see that, the more they realize how this imbalance of recognition, right? The fact that you see the Caserne dossier in Malines, you have a lot of Holocaust memorials and commemorations of the Holocaust in Belgium, in Belgian education, but not of the crimes in Congo. So it invigorates anti-Semitism, and it leads basically to secondary anti-Semitism. And we found very similar pattern in many countries where we've been working with Laura and running this study, also in Poland. And we're doing also some experiments on that. So much of this anti-Semitism, which drives distortions of the Holocaust history, is also a consequence of the feeling of lack of recognition of the Polish war history. So not Polish, the history of ethnic Poles who were not Jewish, right? So you know, this is the facts like the one about the Wola massacre that I mentioned to you, which is not globally known until today. And the last crisis I wanted to focus on today is the crisis of COVID in 2020. And I just briefly tell you the story, which is similar to story in other countries. So first of all, you know, Polish Minister of Health, and first cases were reported in March 2020. Borders were closed. We had nationwide lockdown, a lot of restrictive measures, closed schools, large gatherings were banned, quarantines for travelers, etc., etc. These were the policies, but many people did not obey those policies. And there was high distrust in that person, the Polish Minister of Health of the time, Mr. Szumowski, and rallies against the sanitary segregation, as they said. Also, big rallies against the vaccination, COVID vaccination. When COVID vaccines appeared, many people did not sign up for vaccination because of that. And finally, the numbers, which are really shocking for me, and these are numbers from OECD data showing the excess death per million population between 2020 and 2022 of all OECD countries, and you see Poland on the absolute top. So with the highest rate, highest number of excess deaths per million inhabitants. So Belgium, Spain, and Sweden, you could see had twice as low number of those excess deaths than Poland. So basically, people didn't want to vaccinate, didn't want to distance themselves. And we see many of that in different studies. I've been running several, with our colleagues, several comparative studies across the world. And we've seen that in Poland, there was this, how here you can see the study of trust in scientific information during COVID. And something which was really interesting was that this correlation between the trust in science and willingness to confront COVID, right? To apply those policies is highest in Poland, and the same was true also. And the same was true for obeying COVID recommendation. That in Poland was one of the countries where you had highest correlation of trusting politicians and obeying recommendations, which in Poland meant basically people didn't trust the government, and because of that they didn't obey recommendations, right? So low social trust in Poland, low trust in institution, which is a consequence of this mistrust from previous generation, led to the threat to public health. Very big threat to public health when people didn't obey restrictions. And also, one interesting thing is this authoritarian response to COVID. And we know from many studies all around the world that in times of health crisis, in times of big epidemics, parasites, viruses, new bacteria, we see what's called parasite stress and pathogen stress. and people become more authoritarian generally. What does it mean? They basically, it's like rally around the flag effect, basically. So they support their governments, they listen to authorities, etc. But we didn't really see that in Poland, and I could see a lot of that when traveling during COVID to Germany and to Poland. So in Germany, even when those restrictions were released, you would see people walking with face masks everywhere. Even on open air bus station, everybody would be with a face mask, right? I mean, that's and in Poland, and this was this Polish style of wearing the face mask, which you could see even on TV. But basically, this is how the face masks were used in Poland. And we at the time we were actually we were running a collaborative study with German colleagues. Now, if you look at how Poles and Germans responded to COVID, it's very much an effect of the fact that they didn't really trust the government, that it will be able to effectively confront the virus. These are different European studies looking, for example, in trust in government, how it looks like in Poland and in Germany. But basically, Poles are much more distrustful towards the government and the institutions, but particularly the effectiveness in COVID-19. Do you think that your government will be able to effectively confront COVID? So in Germany, 80% say, yeah, my government will be effective in confronting COVID. In Poland, only 45%, right? So most people say, no, we cannot receive help from the government. We don't trust government to handle that efficiently. And now we've been at that time in the middle of a binational longitudinal study of authoritarianism together with our German colleagues. So looking at different facets of authoritarianism, because when we think about authoritarianism in psychology, authoritarianism is a composite of three phenomena. Authoritarian submission, so basically you obey your leaders, your authorities. Authoritarian aggression, you're aggressive towards the ones who are deviants, who are dissidents or outgroupers of any kind, and conventionalism. So you always respect traditions and norms, so you act as your ancestors have acted. So these three facets, you can trace it back to Adorno and his work on authoritarian personality. And what we wanted to study is how it looks like in Poland and in Germany, and we had the first wave before the COVID-19, and the second wave was planned for March 2020 when the COVID started. So in the second measurement, we also asked people how much are they afraid of COVID. So do they think that the COVID will pose a threat to their health, to their also to their economy, and how threatening is COVID? We measured exactly these three components of authoritarianism: submission, conventionalism, and aggression. And what we found out is not that Poles did not react with authoritarianism, with authoritarian response, but the Polish authoritarian turn was very different than the German one. So in Germany, we found that people who would be most threatened, who would feel most threatened by COVID, would have highest increases in authoritarian submission between time 1 and time 2. So basically, after COVID, they would increase their support, trust, blind trust in authorities, right? In Poland, nothing like that. We completely didn't find that effect in Poland. Compared to that, we found this slight tendency in Poland to turn into conventionalism. So acting as our ancestors did, right? So, what grandmother used to do in such situations, go to church and pray and so on. So this was the completely different authoritarian response. We basically don't seek help from the authorities, from health authorities, from the government, but you try to act in a standard way as you would act in the past, which I think is and now the one thing which I want to stress here. I'm telling the story about Poland, but we knew that the story was quite global. We've seen similar protests, similar anti-vaccination and COVID denialist rallies in Italy, or very big ones in Germany, and actually it was a source of the support for AfD, new wave of populism in Germany. So basically, it were great times for the European radical right, I would say. Now, and quite recently, you could see even this kind of rhetoric in the newly appointed Secretary of Health of the United States, who would also repeat same anti-vaccination, denialist rhetoric. And this is a big challenge for psychologists globally to explain why people believe in those conspiracy theories, and particularly about COVID, because in COVID, as Polish example shows, it can just lead to mortality. Basically, people die in countries where it becomes too popular. And Shira Hebel-Sela quite recently analyzed some data that they gathered in times of COVID, and she found that there is an interesting pattern in the data on the state level, that in the countries where you have ongoing conflicts, where you have wars, riots, terrorist attacks, so the higher intensity of ongoing conflicts is correlated positively with popularity of conspiracy beliefs about COVID. So in times of war, people believe more in conspiracies, and also in such health-related conspiracy theories. And now we took the same data. She controlled for the GDP, for economic indicators, inequalities, and so on. So we took recently the same data that she used, and for the countries where we could estimate the scale of losses during the Second World War, we statistically controlled for the ongoing conflicts, so what she did, for the GDP and other economic factors, and we found a very surprising pattern, but maybe not that surprising after the whole talk that you had listened to. The pattern that the countries that had highest losses during the Second World War, in those countries, there was the highest belief in COVID conspiracy theories today. So this suggests these long enduring effects of the historical trauma. And we thought that maybe this is just an accidental finding. So we're actually in the middle of doing another study on conspiratorial beliefs about science in general. And we found exactly the same. That in the countries that had higher losses during the Second World War, you would see higher distrust in science today. And this suggests that the model that I proposed here might tell us something not only about Poland, but generally about the long-lasting effects of historical trauma. That psychology has contributed enormously to our understanding of clinical consequences of trauma through the research on secondary trauma, transgenerational trauma, and so on. But I think we should also address the long-lasting effects of trauma on political functioning, social functioning, conspiracy theories, mistrust. And this is important because if we can address it properly now, for example, in case of Ukrainian refugees to Europe, maybe there will be no problems in subsequent generations that we see now from the context of the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michał, for a fascinating lecture. I'm sure there'll be many questions. If you could please identify yourself and speak up so people online can also hear you, that would be great. And preferably questions rather than long statements. Yeah, I see already two people. Paul Flabber.
Mine's more an explanatory question, which is, I thought you spoke, because you had a lot to say, quite quickly about the transmission process. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more. We've got the analysis after the war with young people. You talked about how they were traumatized and in a sense, tending towards distrust, leading on to conspiracy. And then we jump to 2020, and we've got similar findings, which is the whole basis of your theory. And so what I'm quite interested in is in the transmission process. Mm-hmm. So there's three generations, for the sake of argument, or maybe more, depending on how long a generation is, and how that's transmitted. Now you can transmit it as you get older. You can transmit it to your kids and then to your grandkids. You can transmit it through the public space, or you can transmit it perhaps through other shocks. You haven't actually talked about communism, the bread riots and dance risings and so on, whether those were adding to the weight of the trauma. And there might be other factors which actually mitigate. Piece of better education, confidence, and successful migration, and Poles moving to Britain, I would say it has been a successful migration, both for British people don't admit it, but also to Poles returning and improving, the situation at home. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about transmission.
Yeah, so this is actually a point of biggest debate in psychology today. The mechanisms of transmission, even in case of the mental health issues, because there is this epigenetic theory now, which kind of contradicts most of what we know about genetics, that even from generation to generation, you might have a modification of the expression of genes among traumatized people, although most studies would actually use animal models and they would not actually use people. So there's not enough evidence in humans to show that there is a genetic change, right? So I would rather say that, first of all, and it will be a little bit speculative because we couldn't really do a lot of work on the transmission of the effects, because this was the transmission occurred in times when we had actually a gap in Polish psychology. So I presented you some results from Ballet, Bilewicz, Batavia, and others. Golden years of 1940s, but it lasted for 3-4 years. And then we had a Stalinist nightmare to science when basically psychology was considered, and either would do Pavlovian Soviet psychology or nothing. I mean, it was the clinical psychology, psychoanalytic psychology, or psychotherapy was non-existent in Poland for many decades. Not many decades, because in 1970s there is a start of again research, but we have a gap basically. So we don't know what really happened in the process of transmission. So my understanding is, first of all, things that happen in the families. We see that the biggest risks of PTSD are among people who, first of all, whose trauma is not acknowledged. So who have no social acknowledgement of their trauma. And as you obviously know, in Poland, those people who would be part of the underground during the Second World War, so the Home Army, they would not tell their stories. They would be afraid to tell their stories to their children, but they would be also not publicly acknowledged for what they have suffered. The same about victims of rapes and sexual violence. They would also keep silent about that. So there was no psychotherapy where they could talk about it to a clinician, right? So that's this situation brought us to a place where they would be passing the fears and the sense of anxiety to their children. So they would be, whenever they would see an airplane, they would say, "Oh, Germans are coming back," or something like that, right? So there would be the sense of existential uncertainty and the existential fear, but without telling the reason for that. So those children couldn't really know what did they suffer, but they would see the consequences of that. So this is how we had very high levels of PTSD. And in Poland, for example, we had enormously high levels of PTSD. We had a flooding in 1990s. And among the people who are affected by this flooding in Silesia, I think that the amount of PTSD was approximately 40%. So 30 to 40% of the population had post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you compare it to war veterans from Vietnam or from Iraq, they would have 7-10%. So only 10% of them would develop PTSD. So basically, PTSD is quite rare. In those populations that were acknowledged, that their trauma was acknowledged, they would have mental health support and so on. That generation in Poland didn't have that. So they transmitted to subsequent generations this vulnerability that would result with very high levels of PTSD in other situations like that. And the final thing, which you also mentioned, the public discourse, education, museums. In Poland, they are full of martyrology and full of those victimhood narratives. In Poland, it's just omnipresent, and every year the whole city of Warsaw, but actually the whole Poland, stops and commemorates the Warsaw Uprising. Polish students in schools, they read Tadeusz Borovski, the most horrifying description of Auschwitz experiences. Polish schools travel to former Nazi death camps, and we've done a study of a few hundred of those young people from Małopolska visiting Auschwitz, and we found that exactly 15% of them developed typical symptoms of secondary trauma. So 1 month after, they would have recurring thoughts, anxieties, flashbacks, and so on after visiting to Auschwitz, because these visits are not well prepared, so they don't receive any support. So these are all contents of Polish education that probably also contribute to that. So I would say that there are many mechanisms that lead to this situation, not only one mechanism of transmission.
Thanks very much. I've got a lot of questions, so we're going to group them in groups of three, starting with John Dumbecky.
Very limited question. Switzerland suffered relatively little from the Second World War. Have you done a comparison between a country like Poland and a country like Switzerland?
You just hold that, and we'll have
Not yet, but
we'll take them with three. So Stefan.
Stefan Trick, Harriman Institute. You mentioned acknowledgement and recognition very briefly, and I wonder if you could unpack this a little bit more. The kind of dearth of recognition, shortage of recognition in a kind of Hegelian sense of mutual co-constitution. And I wonder who the necessary recognizers are. Is it about the world not recognizing Polish suffering, or is it specific to the perpetrators? Is it about the Germans, in particular, kind of insufficiently recognizing Polish suffering? Of course, this is deeply political today, ties into the whole conversation about reparations and so forth. The claim that the Germans don't know enough about the Ostfront and so forth. And from that, perhaps prescriptively, I wonder what can be done to address this. In your book, you talk about bezradność, which I guess in this context could translate as something like powerlessness. Can the Poles get this recognition and the healing on their own, or do they necessarily need that external validation? How do we make sense of this?
Jonathan Lott.
John Luxford, journalist. I have to say, I had the impression that you packed an awful lot of interesting material into your talk. It's very interesting to listen to. But I did have the impression you've sort of cut some corners with the conclusions.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, if you could speak up a little bit, because I can't hear you on that. I'm sorry, I know you have a sort of throat.
I should say, I had the impression that you've cut quite a lot of corners in the conclusions you've drawn from the evidence that you cited. You said right at the end, for example, that the level of World War II losses is connected with distrust of science. That's a very grand statement to make, and we didn't unpack it at all. But my two questions were the only two countries you have compared to are Greece and Germany. Is there any way in which we can put the Polish experience into a wider European context? How badly does the Poles done? And secondly, I think Stefan Scheller has asked the same question, but is there any kind of prescriptive element to what you're saying? What can be done? How can Poles sort of begin to resolve their problems? And also, if I could just add, I didn't pick up any kind of sociological breakdown in what you're saying. You talked about Poles generally, but can you sort of differentiate a bit around the Polish approach?
Thanks.
Okay, so actually two questions already pointed to this problem of lacking comparison with countries that have not really suffered similarly. So we're now doing actually several comparative studies with countries that have different history from war, and we're also looking at it at individual levels, so looking at individual people's family stories, and we're in the process of doing these studies. In the same region, I think Switzerland is very different. It's a very wealthy country, so there are many differences that would probably affect such a two nations comparison. We're doing some work on Hungary, which is quite interesting because regardless of the trauma from 1956, the World War II history was very different, right, between Poland and Hungary, and we I think that probably from that we can try some more information, but we're just in the process of studying that, so I don't want to talk much more about that. But yeah, definitely it would be very interesting to see how it operates in countries which substantially different history. We have one study which actually tells something about that. So this was a study that we've been doing with James Few, who passed away this year. This was a comparative study in which we looked at the sense of victimhood. So to what extent do you think that in the history our nation was very much victimized, more victimized than any other nation, and how it relates to beliefs in conspiracy and to mistrust. And we did that study in two countries that have this traumatic war history, so Poland and Ukraine, and two countries that have rather colonial history, although, I mean, I don't want to negate the historical trauma of British during the Second World War, but the countries that remained independent, right? So they didn't have the history of occupation, of brutal occupation, and who rather had a colonial history, so Britain and Spain. And we found that this correlation between the sense of victimhood and conspiracy beliefs was quite strong in Poland and Ukraine, and the same with mistrust, but not in Britain and in Spain. So these effects that I was talking about, they just don't exist in Britain and in Spain, because I don't think that there is this narrative of Britain as being the victim of the history, right? And or Spain as being the victim of the history, regardless of the civil war in Spain or the bombings of if you go to Coventry, quite close to here, you can see the consequences of that. So, but still, this is not the main narrative of the nation. So maybe this points to the fact that actually those narratives are quite important, right? And they are changing the situation. So they make this correlation visible. The problem of acknowledgement and recognition, right? That it's in Polish case, it's very much about the global recognition, and we could see that this furious reactions to the uses of the term Polish death camps or Polish camps were mostly not in the case of Germany, but in the case of President Barack Obama, saying that during the ceremony commemorating Jan Karski, which is an interesting situation. Like, this is a moment of recognition of Polish history, but nobody talked in Polish media about the fact that Karski received one of the biggest awards in the US. But just these towards Polish camps used by President Barack Obama led to an enormously strong reaction of Polish media and Polish public, and calls from the Polish ministry and Polish diplomacy for apologies for that statement. And the same was whenever American media used the term, American newspapers, Polish diplomacy was reacting very, very smoothly and very, very promptly towards that. And we did one experimental study on that. We actually never published, but I think it tells quite a lot about that. So we looked on these biases in Polish, in the ways Poles acknowledgement. We asked, for example, whether Poles would support donating money to to Holocaust history museums and the Polish Museum in Poland. And in this experimental study, we did a very small manipulation. We presented a fake article about the President of the United States opening a war museum in the US. And during this opening, the president was either openly mentioning the Holocaust and the Jewish victims of the Second World War. In the second condition, the president was not mentioning any specific group. In the third condition, I think the president was mentioning Russians and Russian prisoners of war. And in the fourth condition, he was mentioning Poles among that group. So either he was only mentioning Poles, or he was mentioning Poles among others, so among Jewish people, Russian people, and Polish people. This was before the war in Ukraine, obviously. And we found that actually just this acknowledgement of Poles, it didn't matter whether Poles were only acknowledged or among other ethnic groups. Basically, after that, we had lowered level of these anti-Semitic responses and higher willingness to commemorate the Holocaust and to give public money to Jewish institutions of memory. So I think it gives some hint that Poles are striving this international recognition. With Germany, it's a very complex story, as you said. I don't think that there are any reparations that would be sufficient. This is a very narcissistic kind of mechanism that, it's calling for reparations, but it's not, I cannot envision any scale of reparations which would be sufficient. So I don't think that this whole debate about reparations makes any sense to them. It's just a consequence of those psychological mechanisms rather than anything real. Especially after the masses of money that came through Zukunft and other means that actually were directed to the survivors, to the people who were prisoners of camps or forced slave work. And the question about the war losses, and of course, in any statistical analysis like that I presented here, we try to find the contribution of different variables, right, to understand the beliefs in COVID conspiracies or mistrust in science. But if we can show that this is a significant predictor, which adds to that, which explains part of variance, this is our goal in psychology. We don't say that this is the unique, sufficient explanation, because it's one of the explanations, one of the factors that contributes to our ability to explain, and factors that we should take into account. So basically, maybe I didn't say it modestly enough, but that's basically the modest message that we want to provide through our research. And the prescriptive element, I strongly believe in the passing of time, so that humans basically desensitize, and they somehow can adapt, to the completely new reality in which they function. I think that the longer we have the well-functioning democracy in Poland and peace and stability, the less of the impacts of these war crimes from the past will be visible on the contemporary political life. But also, and very importantly, I think it's extremely important how the history is taught in Poland, how history is presented, how much Polish historical education is preoccupied by war and sufferings. And I see that now there are some interesting changes. For example, Polish historical research, but also public interest in the history of serfdom, pańszczyzna, a completely new perspective, and trying to explain the role of serfdom in Polish history, but also the history of Polish peasants, and will build completely different narrative about Polish history. I think this is very, very important to provide a different historical narrative than just the narrative based on the March of the Olympics.
Thanks very much, Michał. Another round of three, guy in white top.
Thank you for the book. I believe.
Could you just identify yourself?
My name is Marek. I'm in urban college. I believe I can provide a very unique, in some sense, perspective on this entire conversation, because my father, my biological father, was born in 1938, and I have been born in the 21st century. So there's quite a large gap between the two of us, and I can tell you about all of the things that he told me, but I think the point that addresses one of the questions that was asked before is that in my childhood, in my very young childhood, I used to have nightmares about Nazis coming, right? And I was born in the 21st century, which means that the process of kind of passing down all of those feelings and fears is also goes through the stories, goes through experiences. I would imagine the place I grew up in, being surrounded, being kind of a part of my father's stories. And moving on to the point, the question and the point I was trying to make, is that, well, for my father, very locally, rather than globally in the society, he has suffered great. He tells me stories very frequently of Nazis shooting at him. And one Nazi soldier was intoxicated, and that's why he missed. And my father managed to run away. His aunt was shot by a firing squad for participating in the Home Army, or some division of it, in any case. Then, once the war ended...
Could you come to a question?
Yes. He went through communism. And essentially, whenever he sees all of those claims about how Poland, perpetrated some evil, which I'm sure it did, but this narrative where they haven't been on the receiving side, he personally, within his very local experiences, right? It's not a global thing that, the country participated in something evil. It's that he himself lost very strongly. People he loved very strongly, people he felt very strongly for. So I also would say this is the point that he himself is an example of what you described, but I wouldn't say that is irrational. And I would ask if this is my question. Sorry for the long context. But essentially, in the beginning of your presentation, you said that there is this historical narcissism where it is, well, let's say, irreasonable to expect of others to know about our history. I think I might be misquoting you. But essentially, like, wouldn't you say that this is the case, that Polish history isn't very well known? The same way as, for example, Armenian history isn't very well known. And Armenian history contains a lot of suffering, right? And it is in the country's best interest and duty to try to teach it.
Thanks very much.
Lucy and George, I have a slightly annoying question about historical causality, which I think has already been partially answered. It seems to me that there are various kind of causal variables that were discussed somewhat implicitly. There's historical experiences of trauma, which have a kind of objective basis and don't kind of trauma which might exist regardless of its discursive recognition, but also discourses of trauma or discourses that might foster trauma, which might not necessarily be historic. Well, obviously, they kind of draw on historical experiences, but at the same time can be historically shallow, in that they don't necessarily require as a kind of precondition the experience of trauma. One can buy into them just on the basis of group identity. I suppose it's not really clear to me, based on the various case studies presented here, why we should privilege the former over the latter as a kind of causal explanation. If we take, for instance, the Smolensk air catastrophe, where interest or buying into kind of martyrological narrative of Polish history is a predictor of susceptibility to conspiracy theories, that seems to me to be primarily a discursive explanation rather than a psychological. And insofar as one wouldn't expect people who are interested in martyrological narratives to be to have suffered more or to have had ancestors who suffered more within the Polish nation.
Thanks very much. And a question from online from Eva Grossman, which goes to this point about the international recognition. I'll read it. Last week, there was an outcry among some Poles in Britain over King Charles not mentioning Polish victims in his Holocaust speech, following a post by the Institute of National Remembrance on net. This was followed by a series of articles that seemed to compete for the most important victim status, arguably diverting to the core purpose of the commemoration. Based on your research, would you say this reaction aligns with broader patterns of collective memory and historical recognition? By the way, what the King Charles actually said, speaking at the Jewish Community Center, and he talked about victims of Auschwitz, and he said the Jewish victims, political prisoners, Sinti and Roma. Mm-hmm. So most of the Poles were in fact political prisoners, but he didn't say the word Poles.
Mm-hmm. This was, I start from the last one because I really think this was a very symbolic moment. The commemorations of the Auschwitz camp liberation this year, because we have very symmetrical reactions actually from the Polish Poles, not only internationally, but also the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland, and this reaction to the statement by King Charles, which was exactly the one in which they felt that Poles are missing, although historically, and it's accurate, like when you think about the Sinti, Roma, and Jews, these were groups that in Auschwitz, they were part of the plan of total destruction of whole national groups. It was not the case of Polish people, right? So, and again, you see that there is a discourse in Poland suggesting that Auschwitz camp was created for Polish people. I mean, this is the main way it is presented in Polish education and Polish historical statements by politicians, that this camp was created for Polish prisoners, which is accurate, but as a concentration camp, right? And there is no public understanding. Marek Kuciak is a sociologist from Krakow. He does a lot of studies on the public understanding of what Auschwitz is. And people just don't understand it. There was a death camp in Birkenau, and then there was a concentration camp in Auschwitz. And that what we know from we know stories from the concentration camp. Almost nobody could tell us the stories from the death camp. It's a completely different place, right? And the fate of the prisoners they would automatically be sent to the gas chambers. So I think this is not properly understood in Poland, and the effect of that is that when they hear King Charles not mentioning Poles, they are surprised, and because it doesn't fit this narrative. But it's of course very much fueled by the sense of lack of recognition of real Polish suffering, by the case of Warsaw Uprising, in which there was an ethnic cleansing, basically. It was not an ethnic cleansing, but it was a war crime on civilians, a mass atrocity, with an order to destroy the civil population of Warsaw, right? So it meets the standards of our standards of understanding genocide, right? Now, Poles know that people don't know about that globally, and they said, oh, again, King Charles is taking this acknowledgement from us by not mentioning Poland in case of Auschwitz. And something very symmetrical happened in the statement by American Jewish Committee. American Jewish Committee made a statement about the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs not mentioning Jewish victims in their statement about the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp. They made a general statement about the humanity being destructed in Auschwitz, and the non-mentioning of specific. I think it's based, and this is why I'm talking about narcissism. I'm not talking about narcissism to deny the real experience. It's a certain fragility, right? And overreacting to which is based also on objective lack of recognition, but something which will never be. I mean, even in case of the Holocaust, where it's globally acknowledged and so on, but we always want to be assured that in any statement in Auschwitz, Jewish victims will be mentioned. For Poles also, any mentions of war, Poles have to be mentioned, and this leads to enormous conflict, between. And I see American Jewish American Jewish Committee, which has been always very friendly and helpful to Poland and supportive to Poland joining NATO, for example. Now, these reactions they show how historical misunderstandings can destroy such good relationships. Historical causality. You mentioned this problem of historical causality. This is why we did this experimental study with priming, because we thought, okay, maybe these are just people who are focused on martyrology, right? So they would read more about and they focus on Polish victimhood. Okay, Smolensk, they would interpret it. So it's not like Historia Magistra Vitae, but it's rather, generally everything is a plot against Poland, right? So this conspiracy mentality can affect both. And we can show it in this priming study, that just by priming, this reminding, implicitly reminding, unconsciously reminding history, we can actually change people's way of thinking. This a little bit tells us about causality. But of course, we need more support for that, probably from longitudinal studies. So the question of narcissism, I would say so. It's intermingled with the real lack of acknowledgement. So it's like there's this lack of acknowledgement which is objective, and at the same time there's this striving of acknowledgement which is more narcissistic. So I don't want to say that the whole story is about some irrational response. It's partly rational, but it's a very it makes the problem even more complex. So.
Can I push you on that? Yeah. Because a narcissist is never satisfied. But what you're arguing is if there's an objective reality of social acknowledgement.
So from this experiment that I mentioned, it's a chance of a little bit lowering this narcissism, right? But you're right that it will never be, as long as people are embraced in the victimhood narrative about Polish history, we will not see a full sense of being acknowledged and satisfaction with the international acknowledgement. So even in case of Germany, there was a number of attempts in Germany. Even now, with the establishing of the center in Berlin, Poles react with high suspicion. This will be designed by Germans. We will not have a sufficient voice in it. So even if there's something which is funded by German government. So I think it's very tragic.
Thanks. We have time for the last round of questions. I have 3 questioners already. If anyone wants to jump in, there's one lady at the back there. So if you could keep your questions short and sharp. Norman, did you want to come in too?
I could give you 10 questions.
Okay. Preferably not.
I'll give you one.
Okay, can I come to you in order? Thanks. Often.
Okay. Thank you. I'm also Mr. Sakis, the Study Center. You can tell from my surname that I'm Greek. So I could associate what you said about trust and conspiracy in the Greek case. I suppose my question is more about the methodology in a way. So the first one is why do you have to specifically focus on the World War II experience and not go, to other experiences, traumatic experiences as well? Knowing from the Greek case, for instance, one way that you can understand the mistrust and the conspiratorial mentality is to do World War I, the Asia Minor disaster, dictatorships, and then World War II and Civil War. So it's a kind of a sequence of events. Similarly with Poland, there's a sequencing of understanding. The second is to what degree you also account for other factors in terms of affecting that kind of mentality. For instance, you had the graph there where Poland was first in terms of distrust towards COVID and what's happening, but there are also other factors affecting people the way that they feel. For instance, in this country, Boris Johnson was wearing his mask half-baked, right? Or not even wearing it. There is also that, and you had United States second and then UK in third. So I think that there are other factors as well affecting them. My final point was about, what was the last one? How do you choose your crisis? That's also very important because the migration crisis with Islamophobia is one where it generated reaction, but the Ukrainian war with all those Ukrainians coming in did not generate that reaction.
So, hi, my name is Maria, and I do a PhD here, and I do my PhD on the anti-gender movement in Poland. And I would like to ask your opinion on the impact of trauma and that much amount of violence that you talked about that Poles experienced on their current understanding of violence, specifically in relation to sexual violence and domestic violence. Because from what I understand, many things that count as violence in the West in Poland would still be quite passable and be considered part of culture, or there would be a little taboo around domestic violence. And so far, I've read that it can be linked to the notion of self-sacrifice in Catholicism, but not many voices that would link it to the legacy of war. So I'm just curious about what's your take on that?
Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you very much. My first question really is
Paul Betts.
Oh yeah, sorry, Paul Betts, European Studies Center. It's what you actually mean by Germany. It matters which Germany you're talking about. I imagine if you had, let's say, interviewed people who grew up in former communist East Germany, they probably would have their own victim narratives, and I think probably much closer to those Polish statistics. But you kind of lump them together as kind of Germany as a composite category. I imagine that needs to be a little bit more differentiated. The second one is that you talk about this kind of lack of recognition, that's kind of driving the anxiety, the susceptibility to conspiracy theories. We've heard that from Stefan. It seems to be you're suggesting there's a kind of negative recognition and a positive recognition. Negative one leads to martyrology, victimhood. I'm still not quite sure what you mean by positive recognition. We talk about schools, museums. What story are you suggesting they should put in place to challenge a victim-centric story of Polish history that would actually do the work, kind of an emotional identification with the past? It's not one which is this kind of narcissistic, Polish-centric story of victimhood first.
Thanks very much. I'm going to add to the smorgasbord of questions. Lady at the back, put her hands up.
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm a doctor working in Oxford. I'm Polish and I grew up in the UK. So my question is, have we studied migrant populations of Poles in countries like the UK, US, the ones that you said might not have a background of victimhood, and also how we teach Polish history to people in these populations?
On that note, Norman Davis, if you could keep it to one or two.
Thank the lecturer for bringing this topic to it. It's extremely interesting and important. my reaction is how many things were not mentioned. The history of Polish trauma is credited to the Second World War, 6 years. But if people get the idea that the mistrust of government due to those 6 years, you're forgetting, many things. The other thing is that you jumped from a picture of Warsaw in 1945 to crises in the 21st century. There were decades that weren't mentioned. And I wonder if you could just say a word about that. I visited Auschwitz in 1962, where the victims were described as victims of fascism. There were no Poles, there were no Jews, there were no Russians, they were just victims of fascism. And fascism was the author of the camp. There was nothing about totalitarian Third Reich or anything like that. And what seems to be missing, among other things, is something about what Poles were taught about their history in the decades you jumped over. Poland wasn't liberated in 1945 like this we know about most of Western Europe. Trauma didn't finish in 1945. My father-in-law, who'd spent the war in Dachau, was immediately arrested by the NKVD for having survived a Nazi concentration camp. Right? Now, what were Polish people taught in the decades after 1945 about the topic? You said there was no psychology. As I remember, there was no psychology department in the Jagiellonian University in 1962.
There was a center in Krakow, Professor Józef Bogusz, dealing with the trauma of the only Nazi victims, no victims of the Soviet.
Yeah.
And I think they might have started in the early 60s or something, until the war.
Thank-
I'm not quite sure.
Thanks very much. Thanks. There are one or two questions there. If you'd like to address them as you can, and any concluding remarks.
Maybe this will be the concluding remarks. In fact, the education. This was the problem of the missing acknowledgement. So, what Poland suffered from is, I don't want to say that it was a homogeneous era, but at least, first of all, in the Stalinist era, completely no acknowledgement of, the fate of vast majority of the population, right? And then, as you said, the problem of those not acknowledged Holocaust victims, right? So another thing, that there was a genocide that took place there, and those people were also traumatized by the fact that this happened, and the history of their behavior during the time, or not behavior, or omission, all of that has not been addressed until 1980s, maybe. Yes, the Wojski discussion in 1980s started this whole debate. That's something which I could. There should be another lecture for that. I wanted to talk about the contemporary politics in Poland and the effects on that, but much of those problems is because of the lack of acknowledgement for those past 50 years before 1989. Now the problem is something else, that you learn only about Germans, and all those the name of Płaszów. It's not a Płaszów camp; it's Plaszów German death camp, right? So Poles are changing. So the ideological element of that, so the fact that fascism, the Nazi ideology was actually behind this crime, is something which is missing in Polish public discourse. It's only German. It's only German crimes. So if these are German crimes, it means that nobody else can repeat it, right? Because it's essentially German. So it's an interesting question, like how do we address that problem? And I think the best way of talking about it is talking about the Nazi crimes, talking about how they were German, but it doesn't mean that with omitting this ideology, it's very problematic. We didn't do studies on migrant Polish population in the UK and elsewhere. Good idea, and I think I would love to study that more. And also, we didn't distinguish between the GDR and east and west of Germany. we did a representative study, but actually, based on that, we can do some reanalysis of that. It's an interesting joke. The positive recognition and the negative recognition. Yeah, this is what would be the positive recognition. In case of that, I would say that also recognizing certain agents in that. So talking about the agency during the war, not only military agency, but also like lay people smuggling meat from the villages to the city. Talking about those everyday experiences of Polish people in which they were much more agentic, that they were not only powerless, they were not only victims, right? So this is also the kind of bias we're talking about, that we don't acknowledge this, let's say, maybe not more positive or more agentic history of the war experience. And why we didn't also study the effects on domestic violence, but I think it's also a very nice idea to study how Polish approach to addressing problems of domestic violence or sexual violence today is affected by the experiences from the past. I think it's a really promising way to go. The Greece, finally, you're right that I think that the war trauma during, at least in this fragment of Europe, Poland, what Timothy Snyder calls bloodlines, right, is quite different from any other experiences because of the scale of atrocity. And we know that the traumatic experience in which your life is endangered and in which you see death everywhere, your relatives, family dying, being killed, it's very different from other kinds of trauma, from the political violence, imprisonment, and so on. This is why, and we know that, for example, from PTSD research, it has completely different consequences in the mental health than other forms of violence that do not put such a stamp in your psychological functioning. So this is why I think we focus on that. You're right that this was a history of many crimes, and especially in Greece, right, and especially for Greeks from the Ottoman, from the what happened, from in Istanbul, and so many crimes that are also not acknowledged until today properly. The COVID, it's a very good example, and maybe this would be my final point for today. As you mentioned that, in this COVID stats, Britain and the United States are just behind us, right? So they are very sure similarities. It shows us that conspiracy mentality and the tendency to believe in conspiracy theories is not only shaped by this historical trauma. It can be shaped by many other factors. For example, deprivation. Like in the US, if you go to the Rust Belt and you talk to people who live in Detroit, right, in a well-functioning, wealthy, middle-class societies, and today the misery of life in those places, relative deprivation, that's another cause of believing in conspiracy theory. Precarity of jobs, it's another, not conspiracy, another source, another antecedent of believing conspiracy theories. Sense of anxiety, instability, powerlessness in political life, a sense of not being properly listened by the authorities. All of that contributes to that. I would say that this history is additional reason. And as I said, in psychology, we try to take all those bricks in order to better explain what brings the problem of conspiratorial mentality today, which is, I would say, one of the biggest problems of global politics today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.